Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the Exploring Legal Features webinars and for taking the time out of your day to come and listen to me and listen to us today. So, this is the fourth in this series of webinars, and it is all about the Cambridge Law Interview, how to prepare, what the Cambridge Law Interview actually is, and also how we use the law interview in the application process as well. So, how important is it, and is it actually the final hurdle, as many people think that it is? So my name is Maria, and I work for the faculty as the Outreach, One Participation and Communications Coordinator. So my role is to run events like this one and to talk to students, parents, teachers, whoever's going to listen to me basically about law here at Cambridge and about how to apply to law here at Cambridge. So in today's webinar, we will actually be joined by a law director of studies, so someone who is responsible for running interviews, is involved in interviews, and is also responsible for making decisions on interviews and on applications as well. So he will actually be joining us in a couple of minutes because he is currently teaching. And so he is quite busy with that. So I will kind of start the presentation and give you some housekeeping advice. And then he will join us and actually take over talking about the interview itself. So in terms of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So my colleague has actually shared a link where you can find the rest of the recordings from the previous sessions as well. So if you follow the same link, then this webinar will be uploaded very shortly as well. In terms of questions, we've got quite a lot of pre-submitted questions, so thank you very much for that. We will start with the pre-submitted questions once the presentation is over, so we will try to go through as many of those as we possibly can. And then we will start with the live questions as well. So please do put live questions on the Q&A box that is in the bottom of your screen. You can do that throughout the session. If we're talking about something and you've got a relevant question, you don't have to wait till the end. Please feel free to put it in the Q&A box and then we'll touch on it at the end as well. Or you can leave the questions for the end, whatever works better for you. But we will be addressing everything when the presentation actually finishes. Okay, so starting off, before my colleague arrives, I just wanted to remind all of you a little bit about the application timeline and where the interview actually slots in that application timeline. Now, I do apologize if you've seen this slide before. There we go. Come up in a second. I do apologize if you've seen this slide before because I do use it in every presentation. So if you've been to the previous webinars, this might be familiar. But it is important to remember where some of those dates fall and where the interview falls timeline-wise as well. So hopefully, if you've attended these webinars, 1 or 4, however many you've attended, then you've chosen your course and you're interested in studying law, and that's wonderful. And then the next step you'd be doing in sort of early year 13 time when you're thinking of applying is choosing a college or making an open application. And this actually is quite relevant to the interview as well. And we'll talk about why it is relevant in a little bit. Then is booking your LNAT and then the UCAS application. So that is the application that you submit to all 5 universities, including Cambridge and Oxford. That is usually due on the 15th of October. So again, not exactly the 15th, can be a bit different every year, but a couple of days before, a couple of days after. A week after the UCAS application, you actually have to do something different, which is called the My Cambridge application. That is just a little short form that you have to complete with some extra information. So that will bring us to about 22nd of October. And then you might also have to submit some written work, depending on the college that you have applied to or been allocated to, if you did an open application. And then that is when the interview comes. So the interview is, in a way, the final step of the application process, the last thing you need to do before you fully hand it over to us to make decisions on your application. I say the final step. That's not the final hurdle. That's not the only step. It's not the only hurdle. It's just the final one, the final thing you have to do as an applicant in order for us to make a decision. And then you're sort of handing it over to us. So interviews do usually take place in the first 2 weeks of December. I will say some colleges might sort of push them earlier a little bit. So they might push them on maybe the last week of November at the very, very latest. So do keep that kind of in mind, but usually they are at the first 2 weeks of December. So my advice would be, if you are a Cambridge applicant or an Oxford applicant even, then leave that time, book that time in your calendar in case you are invited to an interview. And hopefully you will be invited to into an interview. But just in case, just to be sure, do book that time in your calendar, even now, really, I would say. Because every year we do get quite a few people that might have holiday commitments, that might have other commitments that they can't get out of, and then that makes things a little bit difficult. Now, that's not to say that my colleague will speak about this separately in a second as well, but that's not to say that if you do have commitments, that, you absolutely miss your chance if you can't make that one specific date that is offered for you for interview. You can absolutely talk to the college that has offered you the interview. So that will be the college that you either applied or allocated to. And then you can tell them, actually, I really, really, really have a strong reason for not being able to make that date. And they might be able to change it for you. But just to be on the safe side, then you should be kind of booking that time and having it free if you are pretty set on applying to Cambridge and Oxford. And interviews can't be in person or online. And because in person is a little bit more complicated, then that is quite significant to have, even more significant to have that time off as well. And then the last step in the application process, that is going to be the decision. That comes in January usually. So that can be maybe about a month. For most people, it will be after they have their interview, and that can be a rejection, or that can be hopefully an acceptance. And for Cambridge and Oxford, just repeating things I've sort of said previously, trying to contextualize the interview. For Cambridge and Oxford, all of the decisions actually come on the same day. Not the same day for Cambridge and Oxford, but the same date for all Cambridge applicants, and then the same day for all Oxford applicants as well. Okay, so that's a little bit on the timeline. Again, I'm sorry if you have been through this before, but not everybody has attended all of the sessions, so it's important for me to sort of remind you. Okay, I think my colleague's still teaching, unfortunately. So I'm just going to speak a little bit more as well before he arrives. You're going to have to listen to me a little bit more. So I'm sorry if you've listened to me quite a lot in the previous sessions, but what can we do? A little bit more of me today. The Cambridge interview format, we can sort of start talking about that and start talking about some of the real basics before we get to the actual qualities that we're looking for. It's perhaps a little bit more important than just the format. So, as I said, interviews do take place in December, but actually the shortlisting process for that happens earlier. So obviously you submit your application to us in October. So we'll be starting to look at applications at that point, and we will be starting to shortlist applicants and to make decisions about who we want to invite to interview at that point, and going forwards. So I'm not quite sure if everybody knows this, but we don't invite everybody to interview. So not every single person will be invited. And among Cambridge and Oxford, it depends on the year, but one of them might invite more people or fewer people. There's not a set number that we have to invite to interview. Really, it is anybody who we think has a realistic chance of being admitted to Cambridge. So that is the phrase that we usually use. Somebody that has a realistic chance of being accepted onto the Cambridge course, including the rest of their application and their interview as well. So as I said, usually at the end of November, in the first 2 weeks of December, really, really important point is that all communications about the interviews will come from the admissions office of the college you either applied or were allocated to. They will not come from us as the Faculty of Law. They will not come from, the Cambridge admissions office or anybody else. They will come from the admissions office of your college. And any questions that you might have, be on, why is my interview invite not arrived yet? Or what is the interview going to look like? Or my tech doesn't work. Whatever it is, that will have to be directed to the college. And that is going to be super important during the interview season specifically, and during the interview itself, in case, for example, you have tech issues, you have had a personal circumstance that has not allowed you to perform at your best ability, or that has actually led you to miss the interview as well. Obviously, things like this do happen. Something might happen that actually leads to you missing the interview. It might be whatever, it doesn't really matter. But it is really important to know that the first port of call for all of those circumstances is your college admissions office, not ourselves. And I insist on that just because I don't want you to miss out on rescheduling your interview, or for us to miss an email that you sent us in some way, because we're just not responsible for this part of the application. So it is your college, and I'll bang on about this later as well. You might have 1, 2, or 3 interviews even. More commonly, it will be 1 to 2. Each of them will be about 20 to 45 or 50 minutes. If it is more interviews, so 1 to 2, it's more likely to be 20 to 25. If it is one longer interview, then you are more likely to be 45 to 50 minutes, actually. It's very rare that you'd have 3 interviews of 40 to 45 minutes. You do not have the time for that. We do not either. It would usually be 20 to 25 minutes and 2 interviews, usually. The interviews by academics. Overwhelming majority of cases, that will be law academics. So people that teach law, either in the college that you were applied or allocated to, or perhaps sometimes in another college as well, just depending on capacity. Sometimes before an interview, you might be given some pre-reading material to consider. And that can be things like a case study, that can be things like a piece of legislation, that can be, quite a range of different things, but usually those 2. It's not very, very long. It can be a page to maybe 4 or 5 pages sometimes, but usually it's a bit shorter than that. And the pre-reading time, so how much time you've got to consider that, to read the text and to consider the ideas in the text, that will vary as well. If it is a short text, or if the interviewers just wanted to give it a quick read, it might be 10 to 15 minutes. If the interviewers genuinely want you to think about it and to make notes, then that might be a little bit longer. So that might be 30 minutes to an hour even. So sometimes it can actually be quite long before the interview. And all of the information about receiving your pre-reading, you will get in your interview invitation email. So all of the timings in your interview invitation email will have been calculated with pre-reading as well. So you might get an email and that says, oh, actually, your interview starts at 11, but then your pre-reading will be at 10. So you'll get kind of a schedule in that interview invite. It will look like a timetable for the day. And Cambridge interviews, as I said, may take place online on different platforms. Usually Zoom, I would say, especially in the last couple of years, we mainly use Zoom, or they might take place in person as well. If you are wondering which colleges do run interviews in person, then all of that information is on our undergraduate website. I believe this year it's 7 or 8 colleges that will run interviews in person. So that would be the people that run interviews in 2024 for entering 2025. For entering 2025 onwards, that information will be updated. But if it is important to you, whether you want an online interview or an in-person interview, then college choice might be that you can consider that in your college choice as well. Does that college hold online interviews? Does that college hold in-person interviews? Which one is it, basically? In terms of whether there is an advantage or a disadvantage to either format, there really isn't. There really is no advantage or disadvantage to either. Some people think that, if I've got an in-person interview, I can look nicer or act more confident, or the interviewers can get to know me better. But really, there is no disadvantage or advantage. We assess applicants the same way. We look for the same qualities in people. We look for the same abilities and the same background. Usually the format itself is the same as well. So the pre-reading and the questions we ask are the same. So really don't think that this is a massive, massive factor in the outcome of your application or in the chances that you have to be successful, because it really, really isn't that big of a deal unless it is important to you and you feel like you work better in one format or the other. Okay, I'm just going to continue talking. Sometimes teaching can take a bit too long. Sometimes people get caught up in things. So I'm just going to continue talking for now. And hopefully we will be joined by our Director of Studies a little bit later. And we're just at the beginning of the presentation, to be fair. So lots of time for him to join. Okay. So, moving on about how much the interview actually matters. Is it important? Is it not important? How much weighting does it have within the sort of full application? Let's see how much that matters. It is a very common misconception, actually, that interviews are the end and of everything, or the only thing that we consider, or that they trump even all of the other parts of the application, and that is just simply not true. Interviews are a part of a whole. Sorry, my slide is taking a little bit longer to load again. It is one part of the application. So let's look a little bit about first what we're actually looking for, and also why we are doing interviews to begin with. So we're looking for a fit of your interests and your aptitudes for law. So we want people that are genuinely really, really excited to study law and that they can think in a legal way. So people that really have the skills that are necessary for a law degree. People that are motivated to do law and that they've got specific subject interests as well. People that are really enthusiastic for complex ideas, challenging ideas, thinking one step further than what is just on the paper, thinking one step further than what is just taught at school. People that can be clear in how they express themselves, in how they communicate with others, and people that have analytical and critical ability. But we're primarily also looking for people that are intellectually flexible. So people that are open to new ideas and can think through problems and situations, applying what they already know and what they are learning to new or unknown situations. And the reason we want to check that is because that is precisely what the supervision system at Cambridge is like. All about dealing with new problems, dealing with new situations, what that you don't know or you might not have encountered before, using the knowledge, using the skills that you've already gained. Skills that you've gained through your qualifications, skills that you've gained through your supercurricular exploration, whatever it might be. So essentially, an interview is like a mini supervision or a mini tutorial. It is a little bit of a practice for us to see, will this person fit our specific teaching system? Okay. And oftentimes people ask, why was I not successful at interview? I've done so much supercurricular work. I have looked around so many books and articles, and I have done all these sorts of things, and I have great grades at school. I'm really, really smart. And you might be all these things, but if you don't fit the specific system, the specific teaching system here at Cambridge, then you might not be a good candidate for the course, even if you're the most academically able person in the world. And this is why we have interviews. Okay. But it is also important to note that interviews are predominantly academic. They are academic, they are subject focused, they have to do with law. We will not ask you questions about, different miscellaneous things or encyclopedic knowledge or, your personality or anything like that. It's all about law, your legal skills, your legal interests. And we're looking for people that don't even have prior knowledge of law necessarily. Yes, it's really, really positive if you have managed to read a lot around law, that you're reading the news, you've got legal ideas, and you've got subject interests, but it's not necessary. We don't expect you to have memorized the entire, UK constitution to come to a law interview. That's not really the point. It's more about how you think and how you approach new problems. So we don't expect you to have prior knowledge of law. Okay? I'll have to put up with my slides being quite slow today, There we go. So, as I mentioned before, the interview comes as part of a whole, okay? So it is one in a big list of things that we look at. And again, we've talked about this in previous sessions, but I'll go through them again. So we'll look at your academic record, and these are your A levels and your GCSEs. We'll look at your personal statement. We'll look at your school or your college reference. We'll look at any written work that you might have submitted. We'll look at your performance in the LNAT, and we'll look at contextual data as well. And of course, the interview if you're invited to one, okay? We do consider every single application individually. We take all aspects into account, and no part of an application is considered in isolation. All available information is looked at if we make decisions. The interview is not the only thing we are considering, okay? It is one of them, but it's not the final hurdle in any sort of situation. So that's really, really, really important to note. And we do look at your interview scores throughout the application process as well. as we do with the rest of your application. So last time, we talked a little bit about personal statements, and we said that the personal statement is not just a factor we look at to see if we want to invite you to interview. We will look at it again if, for example, we've given you an offer and you've missed your grades, or if we're considering making you an offer against someone else. We will look at all of these things together, okay? Brilliant. Okay, so what most of you are probably here about is actually, how do I prepare for a Cambridge Law interview? What can I do as a student to prepare for a Cambridge Law interview and to be successful? There we go. It's perfect timing. There he is. So I'm going to hand off to, very quickly, Nabil. Okay, thankfully he can hear us. I'm going to hand off to someone who can talk to you much more effectively about how to prepare for a law interview than I can, because he has run many himself. So, Nabil, if I can ask you to introduce yourself and then start talking about how you can prepare a law interview.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Nabil, and I serve as a lecturer in law and also as fellow and director of studies at one of the colleges here. And yeah, I have conducted a number of interviews and also sat through an interview myself several years ago. So I think experience from both sides. But yeah, you're probably here to learn more about the experience from, well, what does it take to impress maybe an interviewer? And as Maria probably said, we've prepared some slides and also just some thoughts that might help in that regard. So if we're all set, then Maria, I'll jump straight in. So one of the first questions, of course, that will arise is, well, how can you prepare even before you maybe have an interview date set? So there's obviously like the sort of formal preparation that might come in terms of in the weeks before. But I think already now, I think the most important thing is to just get used to the kind of conversations where you are exploring, I think, just questions that might go a little bit deeper, perhaps, than just the sort of conversations that we might have. And this can be, these can be conversations around politics, it can be history. It can, of course, be law, but it doesn't have to. And the reason I think that's helpful is because it just trains our mind and also trains our conversational skills, which is, I think, really what comes through in these interviews and what's important, because having good ideas is one thing, but having the ability to communicate them is a second thing. And I think the hardest thing is being then able to build on the contributions of others, and maybe how that modulates and sort of changes the way that you might think or you might explain something. And I can already tell you that one area where we see people maybe not do quite as well as they could is they're not able to change their mind. So they'll say something and then they might be questioned about it, and then they'll just say the same thing again, or they think they have to defend what they've said. And then so I think that comes very much through just practicing, as you see also on the slide, sort of this idea of thinking out loud and talking through sort of a sequence of logic as well, and always being willing and able to learn from other people, and adjusting your thoughts, and maybe even changing your views on things. I think that's a really good thing to show. Yeah, so now for law in particular, there are a few things that you can do. I don't think anything as such is required, but I think that with the resources that are out there, and I have to say, I think particularly, for instance, on YouTube, you see also here one of the bullet points is Supreme Court hearings. I don't know if you're aware, but the Supreme Court actually has its own YouTube channel, and don't worry, like it doesn't mean you have to sit through an entire case, but what they also what they post quite often, like 20-minute summaries of the case, which I think is, really, really helpful. And also how to articulate legal points is something that we can all learn, of course, from the judges. And in addition to what's out there in terms of YouTube, of course, you can physically also go into court. So you can go to your local county court, you can sit in. You can go to the High Court, Court of Appeal, and indeed even Supreme Court. And and then the other thing that I think is really helpful is if you sort of read maybe in newspapers or sort of online, like where you read about legal cases and issues that are maybe making their way through the courts right now. And what's good about sort of either magazines or newspapers is that I think that they express legal concepts in a way that are understandable for everyone, because if you read, say, a judgment, that can become pretty technical. And the last thing you want to do actually in an interview is sort of semi-memorize technical terms and then not really be able to go much deeper. And I think it's much better to just be able to explain legal issues, but in language that you're completely familiar with. And then, of course, staying on top of the news generally, like major developments that are going on and how that's affecting politics. Like this should really be, I think, a genuine passion that you develop. So also sometimes things that I guess we see is that you can tell that someone knows about an area or clearly has followed something, but you're not quite sure if it was sort of done just to prepare or if it's really something that they developed an interest for. And for obvious reasons, I think it's much better to develop that interest genuinely, and that also has an impact actually on how confident you are in the interview. Because as you know, just from life in general, if you're talking about something that you really care and know about, you're not nervous, you're really confident, you're able to make interesting points. And one example that sometimes I give is for anyone that enjoys, I don't know, football and watching the Premier League or other leagues, and you have a favorite team. Many people know so much about their team, right? Like they know the starting lineup, they know the substitutes, they know how they play tactically, they know all the results from the last matches, and that's just a product of really like their interest, right? Like they didn't have to study for that. And I think if you can start developing some of those things for the law, it doesn't have to be the law, but just I think political issues, economic questions, everything that sort of relates to that, then that will really come through. Good. We'll go to the next. Okay, so looking at preparation now for the actual interview. So that might be obvious, but definitely review your application and particularly the personal statement. Why? Well, because you might have questions that directly ask you to build on something in your personal statement. And then if you say, oh, well, I don't really remember that or thing, then it's like, okay, well, how come that's in your statement? So I think that's a sort of obvious one. And another thing, which is sort of this third bullet point, is that very often the interviewers will be interested in the process actually of how you've gained or developed certain skills, such as the critical thinking, analytical abilities, arguments, and so on. And not just that you say, these are what I have, which maybe, of course, in the statement will already be evident, but then in the interview, you can actually talk to this experience helped me to develop these skills, and this is the way in which that happened. So making that link very, very express. And then in terms of the motivation for studying law, like that, again, maybe it is a given, but I think sometimes I have noticed that maybe sometimes students, struggle a little bit. Maybe because it's such an obvious question as you don't expect it. And again, there's obviously no set question, so it may not come up. But I think having that motivation very clear in your own mind is really, really important. And it can be very niche things, right? So the law is obviously such a broad thing, and I think it's always very interesting when someone has taken an interest, say, in like one particular area of intellectual property law or land law or criminal law, and then if you also have cases maybe that you're following, or just issues that you're following, maybe currently, for instance, in international law, right? There's a lot of issues going on, and if you're then able to speak to that as an example of what you found fascinating, then that's always, I think, a very good starting point. And you definitely don't want to stay in abstraction. So you don't want to just say something like, well, I think international law is really interesting, and then just leave it there without, offering a little bit as to why. And then, as you also see, I mean, there's no actual knowledge that you're expected, let alone memorizing anything. But always know that if you mention something, let's say even a book or an article or something, then it is fair game to maybe ask you about it, right? So I wouldn't just name drop something, but always make sure that you have some familiarity if you do mention any books or articles. Okay, great. We can go to the next slide. All right. So I should premise, we're going to look at do's and don'ts of the interview. And I should premise everything with, it is far better always, and I know this may sound a little bit sort of cliche, but for you to find a way to be yourself, in the sense that you can show the best version of yourself. Okay, so if it becomes too formulaic, then it can put a lot of pressure on you if you have all these thoughts in your mind, obviously, as to what you need to do, what you need to say, and typically that doesn't then work in your favor. But if you do all the preparation on what we sort of talked about, like you to familiarize yourself deeply, and you've practiced speaking about these things, then you should also be able to, I think, walk into these interviews and see them as an extended conversation. So I know it's always harder in practice to do that, but I think that's really important to see if you can sort of find a way to be comfortable in, yes, what is of course a very unusual environment that you might not obviously be in every day. So that's the be yourself bullet, which sort of is an overarching theme for everything. Then, very important, asking for guidance or help or taking some time is completely possible, and not just possible, but I think personally quite well received. If you get a difficult question, instead of trying to divine what it is that the questioner asked you, just ask for clarification. Or if you know what they asked, but it's a difficult question and you need some time, then you can say, could I have a moment, to think? And you'll always be given that time. And you'll also find that when you're obviously in an environment like this, and maybe nerves play a part, and you get a question, it's possible that you might have an idea that instantly comes to your mind, and then you want to share it also as a way of relieving some of that nervousness or that stress. You're like, oh, okay, I have an answer and now I'm going to go and say it. But you want to take that extra moment. So even if you have an answer and even if you have, say, okay, maybe there is something else, right? So it might just be an extra sort of, whatever it is, 20, 30 seconds to think about if there's another dimension to it. And maybe what you then share is the first thought that came to your mind, and maybe not. Now, the next point is really important and links a little bit to what I mentioned before, but there is this idea sometimes that people think they have to give sort of black or white answers. So if you get a question, I don't know, you take a question like, whoa, what are human rights or something? And then you think, and then you're like, right, I have to have a polished answer. That's not the case. A lot of these questions are designed so that you, in a sense, you think out loud. And sometimes it can, I think, just be really helpful to mention that, right? So you get a question, you say, I have a sort of view on this and I have an idea and I'm, going to just sort of share my line of thinking. And then you start. And instead of sort of thinking you have to have this polished idea, and then maybe in the middle of that line of thinking, you might get another question and you sort of can refine that a little bit. And I think that prevents you also from having sort of put yourself in a position where you then have to walk back too much or sort of have to adjust what you're saying. And then, yes, obviously in terms of what you should wear, like make sure that you are comfortable. So sort of but also like maybe a degree of, formality, no suits, of course, but yeah, also don't, sort of show up in a pajama, but that's probably understood. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So a couple more on the don'ts. Right. So one point, and again, it's always, I think, easier in theory than in practice, but if you get a really difficult question, or maybe the question is okay, but the nerves have taken over and you just can't think of anything and you're blanking, still engage in that process and try to find a way to make a start. Because if you just sit there and say nothing at all, then it's actually very difficult, because it's quite unlikely that the interviewers are going to say, okay, then we'll ask a completely separate question. So I think making a start, and then also being, conscious of the fact that the interviewers are trying to get you to a place where you can show, your qualities. It's not about catching you out. It's not about that, but it's really about allowing you to demonstrate your capacity. But for that, you need to always make a start. And again, I think you'll find that even if you say, well, I'm not entirely sure, but in the first instance, this is what I think, so and so, and then you can sort of take it from there. In terms of language, as I said before, yes, it doesn't have to be technical, fancy, formal. If you happen to use a term of art, or if you happen to, need to describe a concept in a way that might sound a bit technical, for instance, if you say, I don't know, postmodernism, but okay, that's what you mean, that's absolutely fine. But don't think that you have to somehow ornate your language with these concepts in order to impress anyone. I think it's far more about, it's far more just about your ideas and your ability to think, and in a sense, whether you use fancy concepts or not, that's neither here nor there, but probably better to avoid them if they're not natural to the way that you think um, and also write. But, if maybe the way that you talk about things is very, very different to the way that you've put in your personal statement, that's also better to be avoided. And then on the similar theme as well, sort of artificiality is also don't sort of over rehearse. Certainly don't memorize. It's probably sort of obvious, but and it's not so much about the content. Obviously, like you might rehearse something and the content is really good, but you have to remember that these interviews are conversations ultimately. It's a two-way conversation, and if someone is has a very, very much a rehearsed answer to certain questions, it doesn't really allow for that sort of more dynamic and fluid approach, which is what most of these interviews are. Okay, so that's some of the do's and don'ts. So following the pandemic, interviews moved online, and currently it's a college by college decision. So you'll find that some hold it online, and if they do, then you'll be informed about the requirements and how it'll all work. And then it is, a good idea for you to test the technology, have as good a camera as possible. Make sure that, of course, the internet connection is stable. Your laptop is charged, or that you're connected to power. Be conscious of your environment. I mean, typically it'll be your room, or maybe sort of office, or a room in the school, and quiet and private. I mean, almost goes without saying, and you'll also be typically asked to confirm that you're alone in the room. And yes, a question that I think comes up from time to time is can you have pen and paper and thing? And that's absolutely fine. You can have that. You can make notes. And then having maybe a glass of water as well is just a good idea. Simply because sometimes you don't know, you might get a bit nervous and it's harder to speak, and then just having some water to help sort of clear your throat is very helpful. And I have found, so we've done quite a bit of online interviewing, and I think most people are quite comfortable with that. I think also, anyways, you're used to Zoom and Teams and things, so I think that works quite generally quite well, actually. Okay, so a very important point. There are, of course, so many different offerings out there in terms of services and mock interviews and this and that. The big picture point is you should never have to pay any of sort of these services to think that you're then, that's what's needed to be successful. There are a lot of Cambridge resources online, and I think even just on YouTube alone, I think you'll find, both from the faculty and also other resources that help. But I know that Cambridge and also some of the colleges, they've put a lot of information out there, and you'll see here some of the links that that you can use. And the other point just to make is that some of these paid resources, you don't really also know who's running them. I think many of the people that are running them might not have been through the process, or if they have, maybe it was a long time ago. So that shouldn't be necessary to demystify. But then, as mentioned, there's a lot of resources out there, and I would still say, though, that substance is much more important than form. And you have to remember that, we look for potential. So yes, of course, we look for sort of achievements, but it's more achievements that demonstrate your potential. And I think for that to come through, you want to not focus so much even about being super polished, but you want to focus about putting your best foot forward in a way that's natural to you. And if you do that, that's also the best way, I think, always for us to see what kind of person is this, what sort of potential do we see. And again, so obviously preparation, all these formal things are important, but certainly don't overdo that. And as you see also, as here in this quote, it's not a sort of adversarial process, but it's very much about creating an environment for you to demonstrate your potential, and that's ultimately what it is about.
And on this very, very positive note, we can finish the presentation to actually move on to some questions, because we've got quite a few, so I'm just going to throw them at Nabil there, and he's going to try to answer as many as possible, but I will stop sharing for a second. So we'll start with some of the prismated ones we've got, and actually you've touched on a lot of those, so thank you for that. But something that does just come up a lot, and I know you've talked about it, but I think it's nice to mention it again, is what do I do if I panic? If somebody has a real mental block when it comes to that question, what can they do? And will that disadvantage them a lot when you're kind of going back and looking at their interview report and interview score and all that?
Mm-hmm. Completely fair point and fair question. I would recommend to communicate, and even just to say actually, look, I'm maybe, a little bit unsettled, or can I have a moment to just, sort of center myself, and I can maybe take a drink, and just don't maybe isolate yourself. So I would sort of make it a collaborative thing, say, look, and typically you'll find that your interviewers will be very understanding. And the other thing that I think can help is practice putting yourself in situations where you might feel nervous, and then learn to not necessarily say, oh, I'm going to calm myself down, because that's not possible. Because sometimes when you say, oh, I have to try to be calm, then in fact it gets worse. But just learn to be, in a sense, like content and stable, sometimes in a nervous environment. And there are different ways, of course, to do this. You can, I don't know, give presentations, give talks, yes, mock interviews. As I say, it doesn't need to be this sort of paid service, but you can maybe get a teacher or a friend to sort of ask you some questions, so that you feel sort of those nerves. And then when they come up, invariably in an interview, that means a lot. Of course, we're going to feel nervous. That's just human nature. But it's about not letting sort of the nerves run away with you. And the more you've experienced that, I think the better you are then if it does happen. I definitely remember that was my case. I didn't think I was going to be overly nervous, but then the interview started, and all of a sudden I had this surge of nervous energy. But I remember, like, okay, that's sort of expected. Or if it does happen, I've sort of been in an environment before where I was nervous, and I can get through this. And then typically they do settle as you move on.
It's very good advice. Definitely. So somebody's asking, are interviewers more interested in an extended discussion or an extended answer about a question, or do you prefer it if somebody's more succinct and kind of short in their answers?
Very good question. Very good question. It's going to be an unhelpful answer, but I think the magic is in the middle. So I would really veer maybe on the side of being a bit more fulsome. I think if you're too short and brief, especially if it happens a few times, and then the feeling is that you constantly have to be prodded to dive a bit deeper, that's not good. But of course, if you're, concise, but yet still making a number of profound points, and that's sort of the absolute best. But I think, and maybe just speaking personally, but I do think that the view is that, well, look, if you sort of are a bit on the longer side in terms of your answer, that can always be pruned a little bit, versus if there's maybe not enough there, that it's a bit harder to judge also, would you maybe, be quite as successful here? And so that's what I would say, but it's not a, yeah, it's always sort of the magic is in the middle.
I think from kind of thinking from my personal interview experience as well, which was not in law, but you kind of can tell from the interviewer's body language if they sort of want you to kind of stop. You can see them kind of going, okay, we can sort of move on. So they're sending you these signals of, this is a good place to sort of stop or make a comment, or you can kind of pick up, I think, if you're maybe talking too much, but you may not be able to pick up as much if you're not saying enough, I guess. So yeah. Um, what was the other question that I had in front of me? Oh, there we go. I think you touched on that briefly as well. But basically, do you look for more people that can argue their case, or people that will change sides? So is it better to stick to your guns, or is it better to go with the flow of what their interviewers are saying?
It's another very good question. And I think that it's probably between those two. I think it's better to show some circumspection and to show that you have the ability to change your mind. But if you, having heard the views against your position, you still maintain that what you have said initially is correct, then at least acknowledge that, So you might say something like, I see that there are valid points against my position, and particularly this and this point is very strong, and I can see how that, might take away from what I said before. Nevertheless, on balance, I do maintain my initial view simply because X, Y, and Z. So I think even if you maintain it, do it in such a way that's not belligerent. If you just dismiss the points against your position and you say, no, well, those are not good points at all, but you don't really explain it, or you just think that you have to double down, then that's typically, I think, to be avoided. And indeed, even later on, what we find, I think, is that, when students write essays, the ones that tend to score better are the ones that are able actually to see both sides of an argument without necessarily sitting on the fence. So they might still develop a thesis, but they're sensitive to the points. And that's also a skill that's going to become really important in practice.
Excellent. Yes, that's really good. Thinking a little bit more about the content of the personal statement. Sorry, of the interview now. I gave it away. But how much do you ask people about their personal statement? Does that sort of depend on the college? How big of a part of the interview is discussion in the personal statement, if at all?
Yes, so that really depends. So that's going to depend on the college, on the interviews. I don't think there's no sort of guideline on that, but from perspective of an applicant, I would just always be ready. And I think you see everything. I think you see some that are, that ask a lot on that, and some that don't ask at all, actually. So that's a college by college, interviewer by interviewer.
Really good question. And somebody else is also asking about will be asked a lot about the news or current affairs. How much am I expected to be informed on these sorts of things?
No. So there is no knowledge about current affairs or even history, thing that you're expected to know for law. As I said before, though, anything that you mention, that then is fair game. So you have to just make sure that what you do mention, you do know something about. Or you can, of course, mention something and say, I don't know much about this, but it sounds like this is related to what's currently going on, but I have limited knowledge, which is also really refreshing. It's completely fine, and that's understood. Your knowledge of, of course, you're currently maybe in school, you're focusing on other things, and there's certainly no expectation that any sort of current affairs are known. So you're not going to, I think, you're not going to get a question that's going to hinge on that. But of course, to the extent that you can bring in examples from current affairs and things, that's, of course, I think, really I think that makes for a very strong answer.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just another two, maybe three questions, because we're running out of time as well. But I think this is a really important one, and it is: are colleges generally willing to provide access arrangements? So somebody is asking for autistic students in this case, but any kind of disability or learning disability the student might have. Will college provide access arrangements for that?
Yeah, that is an important question, and the answer is absolutely. And they take it very seriously as it's part of also making sure that you can put your best foot forward, and it's also on an equal footing and equality of opportunity. And I think that the college then beforehand, they make these arrangements. They can be informed also about specific requirements or needs, and there is a process for that. Um, and again, from experience, where adjustments have been made, I think that's always worked very well. So the answer is yeah, absolutely.
Very important. I will add, I used to work in college admissions. So from a college admissions perspective, because I'm still not over that mindset, is please let people know as early as possible, because it is a lot easier for those arrangements to be put in place if you let your college know the moment they ask you. So they will ask you to submit something called an extenuating circumstance form, as well as a couple of other forms about arrangements for the interview. Please fill those out as soon as possible, because then they're a lot more likely to be able to accommodate you as well as possible. So yeah, bit of a random addition from me there. But last question. I know we've got a lot of questions coming in and a lot more that we've already answered. So we're not going to get to all of them. I do apologize. But kind of a last question, hopefully to end on a positive note. And that's a pre-submitted one actually. Is there a question from any of your interview experiences, any of the interviews you've done, that has stuck with you to this day, or sorry, an answer to a question from a candidate that has stuck with you to this day, without giving too many details, but something that you think kind of regularly about?
Oh, that's a very interesting one. And I'm trying to well, I guess if I have to think too much, maybe there isn't one that has stuck. So I'm gonna disappointingly have to say that I don't think there's any answer that's stuck with me, but I can certainly remember candidates that were impressive and memorable, and it's a combination. It won't surprise you, but I think so. They're enthusiastic, engaged, um, prepared in the sense that they've thought about their motivations for the law, but also what really impresses me is it's also then how they engage with so discussing maybe case law or discussing sort of statutes or things like that, and being able to discover some of the intuitions, maybe like why was a case decided this way, or sort of what was the line of reasoning, and doing that in a way that's not, as I said before, maybe sort of overly rehearsed. But it's a good time to say again that, and I know it's a bit cliche, but it's really true, that it's about, like, you can do well in so many different ways, and that's because people are diverse, and there isn't a certain type, there isn't a certain person or a certain way of speaking or thinking or anything like that. It's about just the sort of, yeah, it's qualitative, right? Like, and that can come in different ways. So there are many, many good answers. I'm always impressed every year, actually, by how amazing you guys all are. And so I think just, yeah, take confidence in that. But maybe when you guys all come and interview, then that'll be a memorable one. But that's as much as I can probably say on that.
You didn't mention any really horrible ones that have stuck with you, so that's probably
No.
all
Also,
really,
no.
really bad ones. Fantastic. Okay, I think we're probably going to have to finish here then with many thanks to Nabil for sharing his experiences, interviewing, and being interviewed as well. I think they have been really, really useful for everybody, and really, really, really clear how people can prepare, what qualities we're looking for. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who has attended as well. This series continues next week, and now we are moving to talking about the differences between what a solicitor and a barrister is. So we're moving on to talk about our professional pathways now. So please do sign up to that session as well, and the sessions after it too. All of the information is on our website, the VA Law website, for the Exploring Legal Futures webinar series. So please do go and sign up. If you've got any questions that we couldn't answer today, you can always email me. You saw my email on the presentation, but it is outreach@law.com.se.uk. You can also find it on the website, hopefully out there easily. So thank you so much for coming. We hope you have a lovely rest of your week and a lovely rest of your evening as well. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.